People in the music and entertainment industry had to know that Diddy was like abusing, kids basically, and yet they still fed him kids.
Diddy party, there could only be two reasons: money or sex. That's all that happens at Diddy party.
A saint going to a party that ain't nothing but sin, drinking, maybe fornication, man on man, woman on woman, he on she. But maybe he'd have to lay some hands on somebody.
Everyone thinks this story has a villain, a face, a headline name you can point to and say, that's the problem. But what if that's the trick? What if the loudest name in the room isn't the boss, but the decoy? Because right now, the industry isn't panicking over gossip. It's panicking over who has receipts. Not screenshots, not rumors, actual data, private messages, years of conversations that were never meant to see daylight. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. See, people keep staring at Diddy like he's the final level, like once he falls, the story ends. But insiders keep hinting at something else entirely, a pyramid, where the bottom takes the heat, the middle controls access, and the top never gets mentioned. Music, media, tech, even the church. Different worlds, same power structure. And before you think this is just internet noise, listen to someone who walked away from billions instead of playing along. Someone who's been warning about the system long before any of these names were trending.
All deal because the industry is a monster. It's the same monster that these Me Too bitches was trying to tell you about. But they hate the monster for how it fucks, and I hate that monster for how it eats. But my God, man, it's the same monster. When I quit the show, all my friends would say, well, fuck them, Dave. Why don't you just do Chappelle's show at another network? Yeah. And why doesn't a slave run from one plantation to another plantation because the master over there might be nicer? My God, man, I was trapped. You know what, tell you the truth? I've even thought about coming back and doing another Chappelle show. Well, but if I do...
That wasn't comedy. That was a confession. And if someone that powerful felt trapped, what do you think happens to everyone else? That's why this story isn't really about Diddy. He's just the smoke you're allowed to see. The real question is, who's standing behind the curtain while everyone else takes the fall? Let's start climbing. Before we even talk about Diddy, we need to talk about power. Because this story doesn't run on talent, money, or popularity. It runs on who knows what about who. In the old days, influence came from record deals, TV bookings, and radio play. Today, it comes from data, messages people thought were private, conversations that never made it to the public timeline. And that's where Elon Musk quietly changes the entire equation. When Elon took over X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, he didn't just buy a social network. He inherited years of digital history. Direct messages, deleted threads, back-channel conversations between celebrities, executives, politicians, and power brokers who assumed none of it would ever matter. And here's the key difference. 50 Cent can expose stories. Elon sits on records. That's why when Elon sat down with Joe Rogan, the conversation didn't feel like gossip. It felt like someone finally saying the quiet part out loud.
Was like an Epstein-type compromise deal, where whether he was doing it himself. Conceivably, people want to think that he's attached to some intelligence agency or something like that. I think he's a gangster who made $1 billion and knew how to control people by compromising them. That's what I think. Whether or not he had help, I don't know. Whether or not he shared some of that information with people so they knew they had compromising stuff on people, I don't know. But clearly he was doing it for his own jollies too. There was something sick about it.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that people in the music and entertainment industry had to know that Diddy was like abusing, kids basically, and yet they still fed him kids. And like, where's the accountability?
There had to be rumors. There had to be. They
had to know.
Yeah.
They had to know.
Cat Williams was talking about it on
exactly.
Yeah, on that podcast.
But like who's feeding them the kids?
Right. Yeah. And what videos do they have of these people where they're willing to defend him, and they're willing to keep quiet about all this? Like how many people were compromised?
Yeah.
The whole thing is fucking crazy.
Crazy.
It's just crazy when because the nutty conspiracy theories is like, oh, there's a bunch of pedophiles in Hollywood. And you're like, come on, that sounds too kooky. And then you see like the Nickelodeon thing and all these, and you're like, what the fuck? How much of this is real?
That moment reframed the entire conversation, because once you accept that compromised footage and private information can control behavior, a lot starts making sense. Why certain people defend the indefensible. Why others stay silent even when silence costs them credibility. Why some names never get touched, no matter how loud the noise gets. This isn't about conspiracy fantasies, it's about incentives. If exposing the truth destroys your career, but staying quiet keeps you protected, most people don't need to be threatened. They just need to be reminded of what exists. And now, for the first time, the person holding the keys isn't a music executive, isn't a studio head, isn't even a politician. It's a tech owner sitting on an archive the world was never meant to see. And once you understand that, Diddy stops looking like the mastermind and starts looking like the pressure valve. Because someone always takes the fall first. Now that you understand how control actually works, this is where Diddy enters the story, not as the architect, but as the surface-level explosion. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Diddy didn't suddenly become controversial overnight. Whispers about his parties, his behavior, and his power have circulated for years. What changed wasn't the rumors. What changed was who stopped ignoring them. When 50 Cent released The Reckoning, he framed it like an intervention. His argument was simple but dangerous. When the industry stays silent long enough, silence starts to look like agreement. And then the conversation turned darker. One of the most repeated claims, and the one that made people visibly nervous, was the idea that Diddy allegedly kept hidden cameras inside his homes. Not a few, hundreds. Not for memories, not for parties, but for leverage. According to longtime insiders and outspoken commentators, those recordings weren't about pleasure. They were about insurance. If someone ever turned on him, if someone ever spoke out, there would already be something waiting to speak louder. That's why people say no threats were needed, no warnings were given. Everyone already knew what existed. That's also why Diddy became the perfect focal point. He's visible, he's loud, he's controversial enough that the public can accept him as the villain without asking harder questions. Questions like, who benefited from his rise? Who stayed close without ever being touched? And who suddenly started making legal moves the moment lawsuits stacked up? This is how pressure systems work. When the heat gets too high, something has to crack first. And Diddy, he wasn't the foundation. He was the release valve. Because while everyone is watching one man burn, the structure behind him stays intact, quiet, protected, and hoping the spotlight never shifts. But it always does. And when it does, the next layer isn't about parties anymore. It's about silence at the top. This is where the story shifts from behavior to proximity. Because once Diddy became the lightning rod, the next question wasn't who did what, it was who stood close enough to know. That's why the conversation always circles back to Jay-Z and Beyoncé. Not because they're accused of running anything, not because they're the loudest names, but because they sit at level 1, the layer where access, silence, and timing start to matter. Online, people frame it like this. If Diddy was allegedly doing what critics claim he was doing for years, how did someone that close to the center of the industry never see anything? And here's where one interview keeps getting replayed.
How does Jay-Z sit down with Gayle King and she not ask him one question about the intersection between him and Aaliyah and Robert Kelly? This is insane that people keep refusing. I've been screaming, not just Diddy, but Diddy and Jay-Z are monsters. Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Robert Kelly, Sean Combs have one person in common professionally and privately. Sean Carter. This has been a fist of tyranny that has been punching through. That changes now, Sean. You have no choice. That Dream Hampton was being financed and ran by Sean Carter. They were able to go and get all of these witnesses because he was there with Robert Kelly.
That clip is why people say level 1 isn't about proof, it's about patterns. The same names appearing across different scandals, the same relationships surviving while others collapse, the same silence holding firm year after year. That's why people say Jay-Z and Beyoncé aren't the end of the story, they're the first checkpoint. Every long-running power story has one moment people can't stop circling back to. In this one, it's Aaliyah. Not because the tragedy itself is in dispute, but because what followed never fully settled. For years, the industry treated her death as an unfortunate accident. Case closed, move on. But online, that explanation never stuck. Because when timelines get replayed, people don't just look at what happened, they look at who benefited afterward, who rose faster, and who never addressed the questions directly. That's why this theory keeps resurfacing, no matter how many times it's dismissed.
Allegedly, Sean Carter is responsible for enacting Hype Williams to put Aaliyah on a faulty plane, to move her out the way as punishment for rejecting him, and so he could level up Beyonce, who was struggling. Let's just say allegedly that happened.
Now I want you to think about 106th and Park with Mary J. Blige. Free, who was a victim of Sean Carter.
Yeah.
Mary J. Blige, who was a victim of Sean Combs, are sitting there talking about the death of Aaliyah amongst each other. Think about that. You got a Diddy victim, you got a Jay-Z victim, and you got a superstar gone. They know what happened. And yet, they had to sit there and have that conversation like they didn't know who did it.
Now, to be clear, none of this has been proven. No court ruling, no official confirmation. But here's why the conversation refuses to die. Because the people named in these theories are still powerful, still protected, still rarely pressed when sitting across from major media platforms. And in the age of the internet, unanswered questions age badly. Silence doesn't cool speculation, it fuels it. Every year that passes without a direct response, the story mutates, not because new facts appear, but because trust erodes. That's the danger zone for anyone at level 1. Once a narrative locks in that someone could have spoken and didn't, the public starts reading that silence as intent, not caution. And whether fair or not, that's how unresolved stories turn into permanent shadows. Which brings us to the next red flag. Because right when pressure started mounting, something else caught people's attention. A lawyer's name suddenly showing up where it didn't belong. Alex Spiro, widely known as Jay-Z's personal lawyer, suddenly appearing around the Diddy legal orbit. And that's where the questions changed. Not is Diddy in trouble, but why is this lawyer here? If this was just about one man, one set of accusations, one defense strategy, why would an attorney tied to someone else's empire be anywhere near it?
Tony Busby, Spiro is a partner, and Alex Spiro is Jay-Z's personal lawyer.
Oh, so it's probably Jay-Z then that's doing the suing.
Of course they'd use Kevin's name, but it ain't Kevin. Why is Alex Spiro popping up everywhere?
What do you think is going on in Hollywood right now? What are you hearing? Because I'm hearing
Mass panic. Mass panic.
So because no one's talking publicly.
It can't. That's why they came up with the story. Well, you know, there's a party inside the Diddy party, and I went to the first party, but I left early. I never made it to Diddy After Dark. There were public relations teams right after Diddy got arrested, running around telling everyone to say that.
Of course.
The question is this. If all you went to was the first party and you didn't know anything about the After Dark, why would you say, I left early? Why wouldn't you just say you left when the party ended?
Exactly.
Because how would you know there was another party if you weren't informed?
Exactly.
If you went to the Diddy party and nothing happened and it was the first party, your speech wouldn't be, oh, well, I only went to the first party. I didn't go to the after party. You wouldn't say that because you wouldn't have known about it. You would say, I don't know what anybody's talking about. I went to Diddy's party. It was a white party. It was dancing. It was wild. But at the end, we all went home.
Right.
That's not what y'all are saying.
Nope.
You're saying, I didn't go to the second party. I only went to the first. The only thing you're proving is that you're hiding being there.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have known about it.
Because here's the logic people can't ignore. If you didn't know there was another party, why would you mention it at all? That's why critics say these statements don't sound like innocence. They sound like damage control. And damage control only happens when there's something to control. This is where the theory sharpens. The idea isn't that everyone did something illegal. It's that everyone is afraid of being connected to something illegal, on tape, on record, or in private messages that could surface later. That's why lawsuits don't just defend, they draw boundaries. They signal who's protected, who is expendable, and who needs to be kept far away from the blast. Because if Diddy ever decided to stop being quiet, he wouldn't just bring himself down, he'd drag an entire layer with him. And that's when people started revisiting something else, a death from years ago that suddenly didn't feel random anymore. When timelines start making people nervous, not to prove anything in court, but to ask a more dangerous question. Who benefited when the road suddenly cleared? That's why one name keeps coming up whenever Jay-Z's early rise is discussed: Big L. Big L wasn't just another rapper from Harlem. He was a gate opener, connected, respected, and, according to people who were there, in active talks that could have reshaped multiple careers. He introduced Jay-Z to key players. He connected him to Dame Dash. There were reportedly negotiations in motion involving Big L and his circle. Then, just days after those talks began, Big L was killed in a drive-by shooting. The case? Still unsolved. Now, no one is saying that proves anything, but this is where pattern thinking kicks in, because when people start stacking moments like these, deals in progress, sudden deaths, rapid career acceleration, they stop looking at each event individually. They start looking at what keeps repeating. Jaguar Wright has pushed the idea that Big L's death was the first in a series of convenient endings that cleared paths for certain people to rise without resistance. This is where the story stops being about artists and starts being about permission. Because no matter how talented you are, no matter how loud your buzz gets, you don't rise without someone opening doors and deciding which doors stay closed. That's why level 2 isn't filled with performers, it's filled with gatekeepers, people whose power doesn't trend, it operates quietly. The first name that always splits opinion is Oprah Winfrey. Critics don't frame Oprah as a mastermind, they frame her as something else entirely: soft power. Photos with Harvey Weinstein, public support during years when whispers were already circulating, a platform big enough to force conversations that never came. And that's where the debate lives, because when someone has the reach to shine a light and doesn't, people start asking whether silence is accidental or strategic. That question comes up again with the school Oprah funded in South Africa. Early allegations, public fallout, people quietly removed, statements issued, officially handled. But online, critics still argue parts of that story were never fully explained. And that's why it keeps getting pulled into larger conversations about oversight, influence, and who gets the benefit of the doubt. Then comes the other name that refuses to fade out: Clive Davis, a legend, Arista Records, decades of shaping the sound of entire generations, which is exactly why people don't treat him like background noise. For years, Suge Knight has claimed that Clive's relationship with Diddy went far beyond mentorship, framing it as something deeper than business. No documents, no public proof, just a claim that refuses to disappear because it fits the larger pattern people are already suspicious of.
Marie, working with Diddy.
You know, personally, I've got to tell you, he really is a major star in this film tonight. He's a spokesman all the way through. I met him before I ever knew of him. I met him when he was 21 years old. And when we met, you know, he played me Craig Mack's Flavor in Your Ear. He played me 3 cuts from the forthcoming Notorious B.I.G. album. And we talked for hours and hours about music, and I bought into his dream. And I financed Beth Boyra. And we had an incredible run, an incredible period.
Again, not proof, but in this ecosystem, body language becomes evidence, avoidance becomes a signal, and longevity without consequences becomes suspicious. Which is how the fall guy theory takes shape, the idea that a Diddy absorbs the blast, while the people who enabled, guided, or benefited from his rise stay untouched, operating above headlines, above scandal, above accountability. And once that thought takes hold, the pyramid doesn't feel finished yet, because there's one more level people weren't ready to talk about, a level that doesn't just influence careers, it influences belief. For decades, the same names have floated around the edges of major scandals, not just once, not just twice, and yet the consequences always land on the same type of figure, the visible one. That's where the fall guy theory comes in. The idea is simple. When a system gets too exposed, it sacrifices the most obvious piece to protect the structure behind it. Diddy fits that role perfectly. He's high profile, he's polarizing, and the public already has an emotional reaction to him, which means the pressure can release there, without forcing anyone to look higher. This theory is why another story keeps getting pulled back into the mix, no matter how many years pass. Whitney Houston. Officially, her death was ruled accidental, case closed, but online people keep asking the same uncomfortable questions. Who was around her in those final days? Who controlled access? Who benefited from decisions made behind the scenes? Family comments over the years, careful but pointed, only added fuel to that suspicion. And once Clive Davis gets pulled back into that discussion, the internet asks a question that never gets answered directly. How does someone spend decades surrounded by heavy rumors and never face consequences? That's where Diddy's role shifts in the public imagination. Not the mastermind, not the final boss, but the buffer. The person close enough to the fire to burn, while the real decision makers stay somewhere the heat never reaches. And once people accept that possibility, the pyramid doesn't end with music or media. Because if influence only lived in studios and boardrooms, this would already be over. This is the moment where the story stops sounding like entertainment drama and starts making people genuinely uncomfortable. Because if power only lived in music and media, you could write it off as corruption in one industry. But critics argue it doesn't. They say it reaches authority, the kind people trust without questioning. That's why the name Bishop T.D. Jakes hit so hard when it started circulating. A pastor, a spiritual leader, someone associated with morality, guidance, and credibility. And yet, for months, 50 Cent has kept that name floating just beneath the surface, never screaming accusations, never fully explaining why, just refusing to let it disappear. Online, the theory goes like this. If someone like a Diddy needed protection, legitimacy, and public respectability, the fastest way to clean an image isn't a PR firm, it's proximity to faith. Stand next to a trusted spiritual figure, and suddenly criticism sounds disrespectful. Suddenly questions feel off limits. Suddenly doubt looks like hate. People also point to how T.D. Jakes appeared in carefully placed moments of documentary footage, not randomly, but in points that felt symbolic. One scene gets mentioned over and over. A segment where Little Rod describes waking up sore after being around Diddy's party circle, and immediately after, TD Jakes appears on screen speaking about love, energy, and emotional connection. To a lot of viewers, that didn't feel accidental. They believe it was a signal, a way of saying, this goes higher than you think. Then Cat Williams poured gasoline on the conversation. He didn't frame it as gossip, he framed it as inevitability.
Years.
Flip is why people say level 3 isn't about proof yet, it's about alignment. When comedians, insiders, and industry survivors all start pointing upward at the same time, the public starts wondering if something is coming, not because it's planned, but because it's overdue. And once faith gets pulled into the conversation, the stakes change. Because now the question isn't just who stayed silent, it's who helped make silence feel righteous. And that's why what happened next, when TD Jakes was finally confronted, is what made this story explode into something much bigger. Up until this point, everything lived in implication. Rumors, patterns, people connecting dots on their own. But the moment Bishop TD Jakes was directly confronted about the Diddy allegations, the story crossed a line. Not because of what he admitted, because of how he responded. There was no clear denial, no firm separation, no direct statement saying, this never happened. Instead, he brushed it aside. Keep it moving.
Diddy party, there could only be two reasons: money or sex. That's all that happens at Diddy parties. Money and sex.
What that clip did wasn't just accuse, it reframed motive. Jaguar didn't argue if TD Jakes was present, she argued why. According to her framing, there are only two currencies in those environments: money or access. And she took it even further, claiming that video and audio evidence exists, and that some of it has already been turned over quietly behind the scenes. Again, no proof shown publicly, no charges announced. But once the idea of receipts enters the conversation, the focus shifts. People stop arguing about credibility, they start worrying about footage. Because rumors fade, but recordings don't. That's where an insider voice, someone who lived inside Diddy's world, enters the conversation and asks the moral question out loud. At this stage, the debate isn't really about allegations anymore, it's about logic. And that's why Gene Deal matters so much in this conversation. Gene wasn't a commentator from the outside, he was inside Diddy's world. He knew the environments, the rules, and the difference between business settings and everything else. So when he weighed in, he didn't come with theories, he came with a moral contradiction.
Rumors surrounding, Diddy and TD Jakes.
Man, what I think about it is this, when I grew up in the church, the sinners was not supposed to have the same atmosphere with the saints. You had to be able to separate the two. So I'm looking at him as a saint going to a party that ain't nothing but sin. Drinking, maybe fornication, man on man, woman on woman, he on she. But maybe he'd have to lay some hands on somebody. Maybe he'd have to save some souls. I know he got a contract with Revolt, so I'm just like, it's just real strange that he would be found at any kind of Diddy party or any kind of place with Diddy unless it's in a business atmosphere. So now what he's doing is he's making, man.
What Gene is really asking there isn't accusatory, it's philosophical. If someone is a spiritual leader, and those spaces are exactly what people say they are, why be there at all? Because in the church, presence means something. It signals approval, or at least tolerance. And Gene's point lands because it removes emotion from the debate. It's not, did this happen? It's, why would this ever make sense? That's also where his comments about contracts and business ties hit harder than people expect. If the connection was professional, why the environment? If it wasn't professional, why the access? Either way, the explanation feels incomplete. And that's why Gene's final warning shook people. He hinted that tapes may exist, that stories are being held back, that when certain material surfaces, the conversation won't be speculative anymore. Because once proof enters the room, everything changes. Here's the part most people miss. This story was never meant to stay inside hip-hop or Hollywood or even the church. When Elon Musk sat with Joe Rogan, they weren't trading celebrity gossip. They were talking about systems, how power actually works, why certain names freeze up when specific topics come up, why some people look calm in public and terrified in private. So here's the real question, and it's not about guilt. Do you think Bishop TD Jakes is actually the top of this pyramid, or is he just another layer protecting whoever sits above him? Drop your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next one.